Hello everyone, welcome to lecture 6 of the course Philosophy of Science for Psychologists.
Today's lecture is mainly about Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn was a constructivist and relativist, and he was influenced by Wittgenstein, that is Wittgenstein II, so the later Wittgenstein, the same guy that influenced the logical positivists, but with another book. Next lecture, we'll look at another constructivist and relativist, that's Paul Feyerabend. So today we will start by explaining briefly what constructivism and relativism in general are. Then look at the change in philosophy of language of Wittgenstein and see how that influenced Thomas Kuhn, and also we'll see that he had some influence on Paul Feyerabend. Now, when we discussed Thomas Kuhn, what we ended with last week was the failure of the demarcation criterion, to find the demarcation criterion. And Thomas Kuhn says, I'm not looking for a demarcation criterion, but when we review his philosophy of science, we might conclude that he had found a demarcation criterion after all. And then the question, of course, is how is this relevant to psychology? What does this entail for psychology? Is psychology a science? And according to that, stumbled upon demarcation criterion. We will not evaluate constructivism and relativism. We will not evaluate Thomas Kuhn's constructivism and relativism. We'll leave that for next week. So today we'll end with a conclusion about the project of Thomas Kuhn and a preview to next week's constructivism and relativism. Today and next lecture, we'll take a look at philosophers of science that defend constructivism and relativism. So we first take a look at what constructivism and relativism in general are. In an earlier lecture, we saw that many philosophers argue that our observation is theory-laden, which means that without a theory, you can't really observe anything. The input getting into your brain via your senses would only be chaotic and unorganized. You wouldn't actually see something. But that means that you don't have objective access to the way the world actually is, because you need a theory to classify, to categorize the input, and then reality becomes our own construction. So that's in the extreme case of claiming that all observation is radically theory-laden. And that means that when our theories change, so your observation theory, the theory you might not even be aware of, so when your classification system changes, well, then you'll observe something else. So what we believe to be the fact will change. Now, this idea that what we consider to be the facts that make up reality changes, you could say, well, our view, our interpretation of the world changes. So there is a world and we interpret in a certain way because we have a certain observation theory. And if this theory changes due to cultural changes or something like that, then you'll see different things. But constructivists and relativists are usually making a much stronger claim. We actually construct the facts. So if we construct the facts, facts become subjective. Okay, this is really difficult. This is constructivism. I'll go in a moment to relativism and see how they go together. In the alternatives to the tutorials, we'll discuss this again in a slightly different way. Constructivism implies relativism. So constructivism and relativism are two different theories, but they go together. So if you accept constructivism, if you accept that we make the facts, that we construct the facts, then reality is not something you can just accept. It's not just something you can take, well, the world's the way the world is, and that's it. And we might try to discover that. That would be the view of the logical positivists. And then a sentence is true when it corresponds to the facts. And now we have to say, well, a sentence still is true when it corresponds to the facts, but relative to our theory which we use to categorize the input and then observe something and create facts, relative to that theory and those facts, different sentences will be true. So now it's still, truth is still correspondence to the facts, only the facts are subjective. And if the facts change, that also means that the truth value of certain sentences will change. So let's look at an example. We have this picture, and say you belong to group 1, and you'll see a vase. So this is input. You look at this picture, input's getting into your eyes, you have an observation theory, and this theory tells you that it's a vase. So thus you see a vase. And according to the constructivist, then you have created the subjective fact that is actually a vase. And if we all do that in a group, then, well, we are in agreement, we have consensus. And then we also will say the sentence, this is a vase, is true, because it is a fact that this is a picture of a vase. So if someone says this is a picture of a vase or this is a vase, then you say that's true, because those facts correspond to the sentence. It's still a correspondence theory of truth. But now there's group 2, and group 2 has a different theory to interpret the same data entering the visual system. The pixels don't change, the world doesn't change, but the theory has changed. And now this group says we see two faces looking at each other. And now, relative to those facts, the sentence, this is a vase, is false. So we have the same stimuli, we have the same sentence, but we have a different observation theory, and therefore we construct different facts, and relative to those facts, the truth value of the sentence has changed. The sentence has changed from being true to being false. So that's what relativism is. Relative to the facts, to the constructed facts, a sentence is true or false. So constructivism and relativism imply each other. So if you have a construction, if you say we construct our own facts, then of course if your construction changes, then relative to that construction, sentences are true or false. And if you say, well, the other way around, it's very clear, if relativism says relative to a construction, sentences are true or false, then obviously relativism implies constructivism. So Constructivism is a theory about facts. It says what the facts are, and it says the facts are constructed by us, by our theories. Relativism is a theory about the truth of sentences. So they imply each other, but they are about different things. Relativism is about truth and falsehood, and constructivism is about facts. Both these theories go together, and both these theories were inspired by Wittgenstein too. Constructivists and relativists have been influenced by Ludwig Wittgenstein. That's the same philosopher we saw earlier with the logical positivist, but now we're talking about the later Wittgenstein. In an earlier lecture, we saw that the young Wittgenstein wrote the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and the end of that book, was that, well, if you can't say anything meaningful about some subject, then you should be silent about that. And Wittgenstein was interested in the higher, as we've seen, so the mystical, the spiritual, statical, ethical, and he couldn't say anything about that because he could only say, well, he could say a lot of things about it, but it would be meaningless. Only the sentences that you can check whether they are true or false are meaningful. So they have to describe reality. So meaning is derived from reference. The meaning, there's a cup of coffee on the table, refers to the situation here, the fact that there is a cup of coffee on the table. That makes it true, but also meaningful. If I say there's whiskey in the cup, then it's false, but it's still a meaningful sentence because I can check with my eyes, with my senses. No, it's definitely coffee. It's not whiskey. Okay, so the sentence, there's whiskey in the cup on the table, is false, but it's still meaningful because it refers to reality, but in this case the facts are different and I can check that, so I'm able to check that. The primary basis of the world is the unconsciousness. I can't check that, so that's not a false claim and it's not a true claim, it's a meaningless claim, according to the young Wittgenstein. But the later Wittgenstein says, well, there's something odd going on, and we've already seen that within the Tractatus itself, because according to the demarcation criterion for meaningfulness, that is, words and sentences have to refer to facts you can observe. According to that criterion of meaningfulness, the sentences of the Tractatus are meaningless. That's odd. So, and the same goes for a sentence like, God is good. You might say, well, that's meaningless because I don't know what the facts would be that I need to observe to check whether it's true or false, so hence it's meaningless. But you could also say, well, clearly in a church where people say that God is good, this sentence is meaningful. People don't say, I don't know what you're saying. Those people seem to understand each other. So, and in the Tractatus, it goes to this, it's similar to that, because Wittgenstein, the young Wittgenstein says, if you understand what I'm saying here, you don't need this book anymore. Yeah, well, but if I understand what you're saying, your sentences, your words apparently did have meaning, and it wasn't derived from reference. So he changes his view. He then starts writing a new book on philosophy, the philosophical investigations. He never published that, so it was published after his death. It wasn't finished, so that is a bit of a problem. And he lectured in Cambridge.
So he started doing philosophy and even got a job in teaching philosophy. He was a bit of an art lecturer, I think. So this is odd, of course, due to the coronavirus, and we have to do this via video clips and other strange things, or at least unusual things. But he apparently lectured in a beach chair in his office. So students came by his office, and if he had, well, if he felt like lecturing, he did, and otherwise he was just silent. So I think his evaluations were very bad. So let's look at the theory of the later Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein 1 says a meaning of word depends on its reference. So the slogan then is meaning is reference. The meaning is actually derived from reference, but if you can't establish the reference, a sentence doesn't have meaning. The primary basis of the world is the unconsciousness. I don't know what that means. Why not? Because I have no idea what it refers to. But there's a bike in front of my house, there's a car in front of my house, there's a horse in front of my house. Those sentences have meaning because I know what I should observe if the sentences depict the world the way the world is, if they refer to some actual factual states. But God is good, a sentence that many people believe to be true, or at least to be meaningful, that is a sentence of which I don't know what I should observe in the world to see that that is indeed a sentence that corresponds to the facts. No idea. So in Wittgenstein 1's theory, this would be a meaningless sentence because, well, you can't establish whether it's true or false, you don't know what it refers to. But in a religious context, it appears to mean something. And that's what the later Wittgenstein says. Well, the meaning of a word depends on how it's used in a certain context. And this context he calls a language game, also sometimes a life form. So it's not just about language, it's more, this context is broader. So it's about the way the world is used in a certain practical context. And then you might ask what the word God means, or the sentence God is good. And people might have an answer to that. And it would not be a meaningless answer because it doesn't refer to anything or that we know of. It would be a sentence of which the meaning is derived from use. So the slogan now is meaning is used. Meaning is derived from how a word or a sentence is used in a certain language game. And these language games have rules. Language games, just like normal games, have public rules. So I can explain to you what the rules of a computer game are, or of Monopoly, or even Solitaire. It has rules that are public rules. Everyone can learn them. So in this context of these language games that have public rules that everyone can learn, Wittgenstein discusses the notion of a private language. And that's relevant to the discussion of relativism and constructivism later, because Wittgenstein has influenced those views. And the question is Wittgenstein a relativist and a constructivist himself? And the problem, of course, is, well, we have to infer that from what he already wrote, because the philosophical investigations wasn't finished. So he didn't answer that question directly, or he didn't write about it directly. But he discussed the notion of a private language. And a private language is a language that only one person is able to understand. So you are the only one that understands your language, your private language. That's the idea. And Wittgenstein is going to think about whether that's possible or not. Who thought that it was possible? Well, at least we'll see in a moment you can construct an empiricist argument in favor of the existence of a private language. Maybe an empiricist should say that all languages are private languages. Is that plausible? Now, maybe from an empiricist point of view, but the later Wittgenstein says this is not plausible. So he argues against the existence, the possibility even, of a private language. And note that a private language is not a code. Because if you have a code, you can write the code down and I can learn the code. It's something that is principally not accessible to someone else. So why would anyone believe that there is a private language, that there could be a private language, or even that all languages are private languages? And the empiricists do have an argument in favor for that. Or at least you can construct that. So let's look at that. You start by accepting that meaning depends on reference. So the word table refers to tables, and that is how you learn the meaning of the word. Your parents and other people point at tables, they say table, and then you as a child are getting a reward or praise when you say table. So you make that connection between the word and the reference, that is, you learn the meaning. You have a concept in your brain that you then use when you in the future refer to those objects on which you put your laptop and your coffee. So this is what Wittgenstein 1 would have said. And of course, Wittgenstein 1 influenced the logical positivist, and the logical positivists were empiricists. So meaning depends on reference, according to many philosophers. That also means then that psychological terms like anger or experience or thought get their meaning from reference to, well, these subjective psychological states. The experience of red, the experience of blue, for instance. Those terms, those phrases, the experience of blue, well, it refers to the experience when I look at a clear sky. And now we can go and construct the argument by using a second premise, and that is the premise of the possibility of an inverted spectrum. That is, an inverted spectrum with respect to the things you and I might experience. So remember John Locke and Bacon and Boyle and Galileo. There were others that made the same point. Locke, at least Locke made it famous in contemporary textbooks. We have seen that colors are secondary qualities. So colors as primary qualities do not exist. Colors are secondary properties. A fire truck isn't red itself, it's experienced as being red by us. So secondary property means that you ascribe a property to something, a quality to something that it not actually has of itself, but it exists only because there is an observer. To be is to be perceived. To be blue, if you look at the sky, to be blue is to be perceived as blue. The sky isn't really blue. But our color experiences, of course, exist. They're generated in a living brain, in a body, in a context, in areas V4. Okay, so that's something we saw in lecture 2 and in the philosophy of mind course. Now, let's look at this inverted spectrum thought experiment. So if it's true that the way a fire truck is experienced, as far as the color goes, depends on the physical structure of, well, the perceiver, the observer, then if someone has a different physical structure, he or she might have different experiences of colors. Think of someone who's colorblind, for instance. And in someone who's colorblind, you'll find out, but in someone who's not colorblind, your language is the same. So I am colorblind, so if I point at something that is perceived, that is observed, experienced by you as being red, and I say it's green, my language is such that you say that's odd. But someone else who's not colorblind might at the fire truck and say, that's red. And you also say, that's red. But how do you know that this person displaying the same verbal behavior, saying a fire truck is red, has the same experiences? Because maybe if you would be able to put a cable between your brains and you would experience what the other person experiences when he or she looks at this picture of a fire truck, then you might say, that's odd, you have inverted color experiences. And this person would say the same about you. Still, you would say that this would be what the other person experiences, or at least this picture generates the experience in you what the other person experiences when the person gets the normal picture. And then you'll say, okay, I don't know what you experience. So we both say the fire truck is red, or they both say the fire truck is red, but you don't know that the person has the same experience of red. And that's in the end where red refers to, because it's a subjective inner experience that you ascribe to the world, but the fire truck isn't red in and of itself. So how do you know? Well, you don't. And that's exactly the point. Because if we now look back at the argument we are constructing, meaning depends on reference. Psychological terms get their meaning from the reference to subjective psychological states. Now, we can imagine that someone else experiences something totally different from what you experience when you look at a fire truck or at the world in general. This person has an inverted spectrum compared to you, and you have an inverted spectrum compared to that person, then only you know what you mean by the terms that refer to these subjective inner mental states, like blue, or experience of blue, or pain, or sadness. And you could argue that an empiricist would say, what's the source of knowledge? That's the experience I have when I look at the world, when I observe the world. But if that's the case, then this basically goes for all the concepts I have. But because they're all derived from experience, and it's my experience, how do I know you experience the same as I do when looking at the world? So only I know what my words refer to. And you can never learn that. We can talk about the facts, the things in the world. We can say, well, there's a fire truck and the fire truck is red. But the actual meaning of your words, I can't establish. So that would mean that everyone has their own private language. Only you know what your words mean, and I can never learn that. Now, Wittgenstein is going to argue against this, and the argument is, well, not that difficult, I think. What is a bit confusing is that this is known as the private language argument. So Wittgenstein's anti-private language argument is known in literature as the private language argument. So that is a bit confusing. So he thinks private language is impossible. And the reason being is that the rules of language, of the language games, have to be publicly accessible. And why is that? Well, if that would not be the case, you would not be intelligible. You would also be unintelligible for yourself. So that means that your words would not have any meaning. So you have to be able to tell someone they are using their words wrong. They are using sentences that are not abiding by grammatical rules or logical rules or rules regarding the consistency of how words are used. So basically, you refer to a dictionary where these rules are. And you can illustrate this by Alice in Wonderland, Alice Through the Looking Glass, and also with the Smurfs. So without going into the actual difficult details of the book of Wittgenstein. So Alice is discussing something with Humpty Dumpty, and there's a moment that Humpty Dumpty says, well, Alice, there is glory for you. And then Alice is confused because she doesn't know what he means by there's glory for you. And then she asks him, what do you mean there's glory for you? And then he says, well, I mean there's a nice knockdown argument for you. So she's won the debate. She has an argument and she's won the debate. There's glory for you. And then Alice says, well, that's not what glory means. Then Humpty Dumpty says, when I use a word, so meaning is used. So he basically goes along with Wittgenstein too. So he's already there. It's not just about reference, but it is about how it's used. But also about how I use a word. So it's private. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. And then Alice asked, the question is whether you can make words mean so many different things. So even if you accept that words get their meaning, derive their meaning from how they are used in a certain context, of course always by an individual, then still you're not the one deciding what it means. It has to be publicly accessible, and that is because you would become unintelligible for yourself, for your later self, so to speak. And that means that the rules have to be, well, they have to actually be rules. There have to be rules that can be learned by your future self, for instance. So take, for instance, a radical Smurf. So the Smurf used the word Smurf for a lot of words, but not for every word. Suppose you would do that. So there's a Smurf making a shopping list, and he looks in his kitchen and looks what he needs, and he writes down, oh, I need, well, Smurf, Smurfs, a Smurf, a bunch of Smurfs, a Smurf of Smurfs. So, and then you go to Albert Heijn, and then, well, what do you need? You don't know, because there's no consistency. You are unintelligible for yourself. So you have to adhere to publicly accessible rules. You have to stick to meaning of sentences, meaning of words that is by and large consistent. So the Smurfs in the original cartoons, they push it to where you can get. So you just substitute Smurf in a sentence in a context where it's clear what you mean. So I have a smurf of coffee, then you know what it means. I can point at it, you know it's a cup, you know what coffee is. So if I say I have a smurf of smurf, it already becomes unintelligible because, well, what's the thing in the cup? What is the liquid in the cup? So it's coffee. So it looks like Wittgenstein argues that there are contexts in which words have meaning, like the word God, for instance. There is the context of religion, the language game of a religion, and there the sentence God is good or God exists or God knows everything means something. Well, maybe in a different language game it doesn't. So for instance, if you have the scientific language game, Wittgenstein could argue, where words need to refer to things you can observe or observe via experiments, then those sentences that express the higher, so also the theological sentences like God is good, have no meaning. But does that mean that an atheist scientist cannot learn the meaning of the sentence God is good of the religious language game? Well, the rules are publicly accessible, so it looks like you can learn them. And that would mean that Wittgenstein is not really a relativist and a constructivist. Because constructivism and relativism is much more radical. But he has influenced the real relativists with this notion of a language game and the existence of different language games in which different sentences have different meanings and different truth values. Okay, so now you'll get some idea of where these ideas of the constructivist and the relativist come from. So it's about the theory-latedness of observation and the theory that there are different language games and that words mean things in a given context. And that if the context changes, words change their meaning or might not have meaning at all. So Wittgenstein did not finish his books, so we can't look it up. Whether he was a relativist or a constructivist, he didn't write that down, but the later Wittgenstein clearly had influence on the actual relativist and constructivist.
One of the main constructivists and relativists is the philosopher Thomas Kuhn. Let's look at what he had to say about science.
It's important to notice that Kuhn did not start off as a philosopher. He started as a physicist. Then he went to do history of science, and then he became a historian of science and a philosopher of science. So that is important. We'll return to the importance of the fact that he studied physics first in a moment. So but keep that in mind. So he knows a lot about physics. He has seen that the project of the logical positivist and Popper had failed. That is, both the logical positivist, being empiricist, and Popper, being a rationalist, they wanted to distinguish science from pseudoscience. They were in agreement that science was a source of knowledge. So they needed a demarcation criterion, and they failed in finding one. Now Kuhn says, well, I don't try to find a norm where a discipline has to adhere to in order to be classified as science. So that's what the logical positivism proper did. They tried to find a norm, a demarcation criterion, and if you satisfy this norm, then you're a scientist or your discipline is scientific. Kuhn says, I'm just going to describe changes in science, how it develops. So I'm not trying to find a norm, a discipline, a property a discipline needs to have in order to be scientific. I'm just going to describe science. So he's not normative, he's descriptive. Just writing down how science changes, how it develops. And he also makes the argument of the theory relatedness of observation. So without the theory, there's just chaos of phenomena. It's just input, you don't know what you're seeing, it's not structured. And then he introduces the notion of a paradigm. He says scientists work with paradigms, and paradigms are theories, but not just that, they're also metaphysical assumptions. We'll see examples of that later, so that becomes clear what these assumptions are. So there are assumptions prior to doing research. Methodologies belong to that, manuals, techniques, they all belong to that, and of course theories. And you can compare this to language games. So you can see that the notion of a paradigm stems from language games. Just like in language games, it's not just about the rules of language, it's about the context. So that's why Wittgenstein also calls it a life form. The context is much broader than just a dictionary. And a paradigm is also something in which scientists live, according to Kuhn. So it's also this broader context, but of course he doesn't call it a language game, because if you call it a language game, that would imply that you accept everything, or it seems to imply that you accept everything Wittgenstein had to say about language games. So it's influenced by Wittgenstein, but it's not entirely the same. Clearly, this is about science, and Wittgenstein was just talking, or was talking about language and about the meaning of sentences. But you can compare it. Now, there are all kinds of paradigms, examples: Copernican astronomy, Freud psychoanalysis, Newtonian mechanics. Of course, the first and the last are the examples Kuhn is going to use, because he was a physicist. So he uses astronomy and Newtonian and Einsteinian physics. Okay, so you can see where it comes from, this notion of a paradigm. It comes from Wittgenstein, and now let's look at the paradigms, what they are, and how they are involved in the development of science. So, one example, of course, then is Newtonian mechanics. And the main idea here is that the world is kind of a big clock, a big mechanism, a big machine. The universe is a big machine. So it's a mechanistic system, and there are all kinds of laws describing the events in this mechanistic universe. And if you discover the laws, you can predict what will happen. And we already saw in an earlier lecture that Newtonian physics was very successful. It made falsifiable claims, and the claims were not falsified, at least not initially. So in the beginning, Newtonian physics was really successful. It made predictions that were falsifiable, but were corroborated. So, but now, we don't accept Newtonian physics anymore. So it has changed. So how does science change? Well, obviously, there was a period when there was no science. I don't think that's something we should be surprised about. So there was a pre-scientific period, and then at one moment there was a paradigm being accepted, and that was the start of normal science. So in normal science, a paradigm is accepted. We'll look into more detail in a moment, right? Then there's abnormal science, that is, one doesn't trust the paradigm anymore, and that means that there is a crisis. And this crisis, one way to resolve this crisis is by a scientific revolution, and that means that a new, totally new paradigm is accepted. And then you basically return to a period of normal science that goes on and on. So let's first look at the pre-scientific period. Clearly, there had been, well, most of the time was a pre-scientific period because there are all kinds of activities, human beings do all kinds of stuff, but they are not organized, there is no structure, there is no educational system, there is no methodology that we could call science. So obviously that was the case. After this pre-scientific period, of course, we enter the scientific period, that is the period of normal science. And the difference is, well, now there is science, and it means that a paradigm has been accepted. And that means that scientists using that paradigm, spending their time solving problems in that paradigm, with that paradigm, they have this idea that they by and large know what the world is like, that they have objective knowledge about the world, that they have a good methodology, and that they are gaining knowledge about the world. That is not, according to Kuhn, a lack of reflective capacities. It's not that they're not critically enough towards their own paradigm. It just means that we have a full-fledged science. We have a mature science. This is real science. This is what scientists do. So this is a description. So Kuhn is not normative. He's just describing what happens. So in a period of normal science, scientists assume that their paradigm is correct and it's working. So the methodologies are working. The theories they actually have developed are true, or by and large true. And that means that we have a real mature science. But of course, the paradigm or the theories in the paradigm are never complete. There are always some problems to be solved, some loose ends, some things you don't know yet. Science is never finished. And there are always anomalies, that is, irregularities. And then what you do is you try to, well, solve all these puzzles, these little problems. So that is what most scientists do. You have this large paradigm in which you work all together, and there are all kinds of problems, and you as a scientist are trying to solve a little puzzle, a little problem, or a bigger one, but still it is something that doesn't make you doubt your paradigm. You work with your paradigm. And for instance, in Newtonian mechanics, at first it didn't include resistance, and then all kinds of physicists try to figure out how it fits in the theory, how it fits in the paradigm. So you try to solve it, and once you've done that, you know a little bit more about the world, or at least that is what scientists believe. So then you have progress. If you have solved the problem, how to fit resistance in the paradigm, you know a little bit more. So that's progress. You solve puzzles. And what do you do then? Well, you publish them. And then these publications are simplified and put into textbooks, and then you use them for education. And what do you write down in those textbooks? Well, the successes of your paradigm. You write down when and where it worked. And thus, you present this to the new generation, the new group of students. This also goes for psychology. In your psychology books are, well, the successes of psychology. The experiments that predicted the way the world actually was. The therapies that work. Those are described. And then you get these theories and they educate you. You're being educated by your teachers, by your lecturers. And Kuhn says, well, basically they're used for indoctrination. The indoctrination of this is the right paradigm. You should do science like we do it and nothing else. So science, normal science, is dogmatic after all. So Popper says, science, the hallmark of science is that you try to falsify your claims. You have to make falsifiable claims, and then you have to try to falsify them. You have to think critically. You have to think, I might be wrong, and you're trying to find evidence supporting, well, the falsification of your hypothesis. If you don't find that at all, then you can accept it for the time being. And Kuhn says, no. What scientists do is they accept their paradigm, they accept the theories, and they teach them to the next generation. So they are dogmatic after all. That's a distinction between Kuhn and Popper. And for the exam, of course, there will also be questions where you have to compare philosophers about their ideas on knowledge and on science. So take that into account. You also have to be able to compare them. Now, Kuhn says, take a look at Aristotle's physics, for instance. So he uses physics. We're not going into detail, but he just says, well, okay, Aristotle's theory could be classified as scientific, but you're now discarded. We don't accept them anymore. And then you say, okay, does that mean that we now regard them as unscientific? No, we don't. It's just part of the history of science. We don't accept it anymore. But different paradigms exclude each other. So you have the physics of Aristotle was an Aristotelian paradigm in physics, and you had a Newtonian paradigm in physics, and now we have a different paradigm in physics. So they exclude each other. So take a very simple example, the paradigm that says that the Earth is the center of the universe, the geocentric paradigm, and then there was the Copernican turn in astronomy, and then we had the heliocentric paradigm, in which the sun is in the center of the universe. And the question now is, if you go from one paradigm to another, if you go from the geocentric paradigm to the heliocentric paradigm, from putting the Earth in the middle of the universe, with the sun going around the Earth, and then you change to the paradigm which the sun is in the middle of the universe, and the Earth is orbiting the sun, is that a radical change? Is this a rift, or is this a gradual process? And you might have the intuition that this is a gradual process. I think most people, most scientists do. But Kuhn says, no, that's an incorrect view. So he says it's a rift. It's a revolution. It's a total break. The new paradigm is a total break and with the old paradigm. That's counterintuitive. So it goes against assumptions in science. It goes against assumptions of your paradigm. Now, what happens before we have this paradigm shift? this revolution in science. We change from one paradigm to another. Well, we have entered a period of abnormal science when there are too many problems in the paradigm that has been accepted so far. So you work within one paradigm. This paradigm, of course, excludes the other one. So that's what we already established. Paradigms exclude each other. It can't be the case that the Earth is in the center of the universe and that the Sun is in the center of the universe. So you have this one paradigm in which you work, in which you live, that you have accepted. And this paradigm gets into a crisis because the predictions that are falsifiable keep on getting falsified. And you make changes to the paradigm and still your predictions are not successful. And then you say, well, I don't trust the paradigm anymore. But since there can only be one paradigm at each given time, because all the scientists accept the paradigm, so basically there is just one paradigm. It's not that there are different paradigms according to Kuhn. Science, because that would, if you have different paradigms, you would still be in a pre-scientific period. You don't really have a paradigm as the scientific community. So those things, those theories and assumptions that the different groups of scientists or group of people have is not yet a paradigm. It has to be accepted by everyone. So then you have a period of abnormal science because everyone is working in that paradigm, with that paradigm, but you no longer trust it. You think this is incorrect. Why do you think that? Because your predictions are being falsified all the time. So that means that you still work in a paradigm, you're still doing science, but you don't trust your paradigm anymore. So that's abnormal science. It's not normal science. It's not normal not to trust your paradigm. Now, how can this period end? Well, there are two ways. The first one is solve all the problems in the current paradigm so that your falsifiable claims are no longer being falsified all the time, but they are successful in predicting what happens. So you solve the problems and puzzles, and you remain in the paradigm. However, there is also a second way, and that's via a scientific revolution, via a paradigm shift. This crisis of the trust in your paradigm, it worsens the moment someone comes up with a new paradigm. And Kuhn says this often occurs when someone who is aware of the crisis comes up with a new paradigm in the middle of the night. And this paradigm is not compatible with the old paradigm. It's a rival. So at that moment there are two paradigms. That is, there is something that has to be accepted by the scientific community and then becomes a real paradigm. And there is something that used to be the paradigm, and scientists will leave that for a paradigm they think is better, but they're wrong about that, this assumption that it's better. So in a scientific revolution, scientists change to the new paradigm. That's what they do. So they accept the new paradigm, and usually they think it's better, it's an improvement, but that's the intuition that the assumption that Kuhn argues against. It's not an improvement. So let's look at an example of a paradigm shift in the astronomy, and that is, of course, the one that we can all understand, even though we are not astronomers or physicists. So we have this geocentric paradigm in which the Earth is the center of the universe and the Sun orbits Earth. And then we have the heliocentric paradigm in which the Sun is in the center of the universe and Earth orbits the Sun. Okay, so you might think that that is a gradual change, it's a slight change, but Kuhn says no, 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 this is radical. This is a radical rift, it's a paradigm shift, it's a scientific revolution. So what was the problem? The problem with the geocentric paradigm was that you don't see planets move in circles, because that was the assumption. The assumption was, so this is metaphysics, this is not physics, this is metaphysics, this is the assumption that everything that is above Earth is perfect and goes in, and the movement of the stars and the planets has to go in circles, because the circle is a perfect movement. Or a circular motion is a perfect motion, because the circle is a perfect figure. So then you have a theory, a paradigm, in which the metaphysical assumption is that planets and stars and the sun has to go in circles. But how do you then explain the difference between this demand of your theory, that planets need to move in circles, but your observations that tell you that they don't move in circles? Well, if the assumption is that everything above Earth is perfect and has to go in circles, and then here on Earth not everything is perfect. So here you see the same things with Plato, right? Plato says on Earth everything is imperfect, everything is moving, everything is changing. That's not the real world. The real world is the world of the ideas. So that's also a metaphysics in which you at least claim that this world is imperfect. So that was the way of thinking. Where we live, that's imperfect, and the heavenly skies, there everything has to be perfect. So then, of course, it's not due to the planets moving differently from what our metaphysics tells us, what our theory tells us, what our paradigm tells us, but it's our observations. There's something wrong with the observations, or with the way we constructed the theory. So what you can do is say, well, maybe we can fit our theory, we use circles still, but we displace the Earth. So it's not in the center of the universe, it's slightly off center. And there is this eccentric, that would be the center around which a planet is orbiting. But if a circle is a circular motion is a perfect motion, you could also postulate that a planet goes on a circle around this eccentric, but also goes in a circle on that circle. And if you then on Earth, then it doesn't appear to us that the planet goes in circles on circles on circles. But if you would be in the eccentric, you would see that. So Earth is not perfect, it's not in the perfect middle, but it's slightly off center, and that explains our observations, and that our observations are different from what the theory says that is actually the case. So still the planet goes in circles, it still goes around Earth, but in a slightly different way than we previously thought, and that has to do with Earth not being in the perfect middle. So you can also say, well, it still doesn't work. So you have this perfect circular movements, you have these epicycles, so these circles on circles, and then you can add another point, the equant, and if you are there, then you would observe the perfect circles. You would be able to do that. Okay, so what you see is they add all kinds of stuff to the theory, and then it still doesn't work. So the paradigm gets into a crisis. because the predictions of what you observe still do not match the actual observations. So you have to change your paradigm. And that happened all the time. And then you can say, well, there's a big crisis and I don't trust it anymore. And then you can change, not within the paradigm, but you can change the paradigm to another paradigm. And that's what happened when Copernicus came up with the idea, according to Kuhn, that was someone who was aware of the crisis in the astronomical paradigm that put Earth in the center of the universe. And he said, well, maybe the sun is in the center of the universe. Maybe the Earth orbits the sun. And we would now say, well, that's an improvement. But Kuhn says, no, you shouldn't talk about it like that. It's a new paradigm in which the sun is the center of the universe. It's a heliocentric paradigm. And the problem is that Copernicus still had circular motions of the planets. And that meant that the predictions made by this new paradigm on what you would observe if you looked at the planets still it didn't match the observation and the prediction. So the prediction again was falsified, you could say, in terms of Popper. And then you postulate circles on circles again. So you do the same. Kuhn uses this example to illustrate the paradigm shift, the revolution in science. So you have this old paradigm of Ptolemy, this geocentric paradigm in which the Earth is in the center of the universe, and then the predictions were unsuccessful, and you get a crisis because of that, and then there is this scientific revolution. You change to a new paradigm, it's totally new, according to Kuhn, in which the sun is the center of the universe. And the predictions were not really better, Kuhn says. So, was this progress? No, this wasn't progress. This was just change. You rejected a paradigm, and you can of course only reject your paradigm if there is an alternative. But it was not progress. So that's why you have this period of abnormal science. You can't just leave the paradigm, because then there would be no more science. There is no alternative. And once there is an alternative, once Copernicus came up in the middle of the night with this new idea of putting the sun in the center of the universe, then that was the start of a new paradigm. And then you can change. Then you can go to the new paradigm. You can't go to the new paradigm if there's no alternative, if there's no new paradigm. That's quite obvious. So the decision to reject one paradigm is always simultaneously the decision to accept another. And Kuhn then says, and the judgment leading to that decision involves the comparison of both paradigms. So scientists compare them, and they compare them with nature. They compare them to basically the observations. And they think it's an improvement. But Kuhn says it isn't. It's just a change. There's no growth of knowledge. So Popper says there's growth of knowledge to the negative way to the truth. So here we would say, well, it's not Earth that's in the center of the universe. We put the sun in the center of the universe, and the Earth orbits around that. So that would mean that there is some improvement, because we now know that this is false. And Kuhn says, well, there is growth of knowledge, but only within the paradigm, and we've seen an example of that. So in Newtonian mechanics, when you leave resistance out of it, and then you're able to put it in, then you have a bigger theory of the world. So you have made progress, you have solved the problem, you know a little bit more. Or at least you think you know a little bit more about the world. But when you change from one paradigm to another, that's not growth of knowledge. When there is a revolution, it's just change. Even though we have the intuition, that it is growth of knowledge. So mind you that Kuhn accepts growth of knowledge, but only within a paradigm, and a paradigm shift is a scientific revolution where there is no growth of knowledge. So when you change from one paradigm to another, that's the brief moment where there are two paradigms, one could say. And then you change, and the old one gets abandoned. So you have a new paradigm, and all the scientists are in that paradigm, working in that paradigm. And it's not an extension of the old paradigm. Rather, Kuhn says, it's a reconstruction of the field, astronomy in this case, in the example, from new fundamentals. A reconstruction that changes some of the field's most elementary theoretical generalizations, as well as many of its paradigm methods and applications. So it's a change, it's a new paradigm. Now, he calls this a scientific revolution. And he doesn't mean revolution in a metaphorical way. He says it's an actual revolution. So we have a political revolution and a scientific revolution. And a scientific revolution is not a kind, something that is akin to a political revolution. No, they are both types of revolution. So just look at the comparison. And what you see is, well, in a political revolution, you see there are problems, shortcomings of a political system, and in science you see there are shortcomings of your paradigm. You have a crisis in both cases. And that, of course, is what you need in order to have a revolution at all. And what do you want to do then, in both cases, is to change the entire system. So you're living in a under a dictator, and you want democracy. So you want to change the entire political system. So you are working within a geocentric astronomical paradigm, and you want a new paradigm because this one apparently isn't working. And now you have in politics then the idea, well, maybe we should go for a democracy. And in science you have this idea, well, maybe we should put the sun in the center of the universe. And then we have the problem of a difference in discourse, a difference in way you talk, and there is no way to talk to each other properly and to come to a rational comparison of the two systems and make a rational decision which one is better. So compare this to a language game. You have two different language games. There's one of science, in which God does not exist, or the sentence God does not exist has no meaning, and the language game of the religious people that say God is good and God exists. You can't come to an agreement. You might be able to understand each other, but there might not be consensus. So there's a difference in discourse. So you can go to the dictator, being the Democrat, it's like, I'm going to the dictator and saying, hey, let's talk, we want a democracy. Then he just shoots you. Because, well, he is a dictator. So that is not going to work. So you cannot resolve the conflict in a political way, that is, in a way in which you talk about things. We usually solve problems in politics by doing that. We have debates, we have arguments in favor and stuff like that. At least that's how we used to do it. The Trump administration, for instance, has, well, undermined that. So it looks like there's something wrong there in terms of the normal politics. So you might say that's abnormal politics. You might need to change that system in America because it clearly isn't working. So you want to change the system from a dictatorship to a democracy. You want to go from one paradigm to another, and you can't really discuss things because you have different languages you speak, you have no consensus of what your words mean, and then you have to use propaganda. For instance, you see Trump is doing that. He just uses propaganda, and well, that will never work to convince the Democrats. Another way, of course, is violence. And you'll also see that happening in America at this moment. So bad signs there. But in science, we have similar things. You have this idea of, well, we compare the paradigms and we have a discussion about that, and then we choose the better one. That's our intuition. That is what many scientists think, but they are wrong. So it really is a revolution, and it has nothing to do with accepting a better paradigm, because we already saw the example. The paradigm wasn't better. So it wasn't an improvement according to Kuhn. So there have to be different ways to go from one paradigm to another. And it's basically, come on, let's go, and you belong to us, and we're choosing this, and then it's peer pressure or something like that. So there are all kinds of different mechanisms other than rational deliberation which paradigm is best, because you can't do that. So Kuhn really means revolution when he's talking about a scientific revolution. And of course, there are always people that stick to the paradigm, the old paradigm that is. So the revolution is successful if the majority accepts the new paradigm. And what then happens to those, well, no longer scientists that stick to the old paradigm? Well, too bad for the philosophers, but they end up in philosophy departments. And you see that, for instance. So I'm not going to defend everything Kuhn is saying, but interestingly, people defending or still doing psychoanalysis are typically to be found in departments of philosophy, not in departments of psychology. Because psychoanalysis, it's passé, it's in terms of Kuhn, it's an old paradigm, it's a rejected paradigm. We have something new. We think we have something better. Kuhn would say it's not better, it's new, it's different, and the scientists no longer accept people doing psychoanalysis, so they end up at the department of philosophy, and you can get a course in psychoanalysis, not at the department of psychology, but at the department of philosophy. The question, of course, is that really useful? But that's an entirely different discussion, but it is interesting to see that that is what happens. And that also means that people can't talk to each other in a rational way in which you get to consensus. So one of my colleagues, actually my supervisor when I was writing my thesis, would now be a master's thesis. So he has written several books against psychoanalysis, quite interesting analysis, new analysis, but also someone that some in his analysis clearly psychoanalysis is something we should not do. And then you have his attack on Lacan and Freud, and consequently on many philosophers. And then you see that he gets a lot of hate mail from academic philosophers. So, and it's not, you're wrong and here's my argument. No, they are vicious, they're mean. So clearly there's no rational debate anymore. If you're interested in refutation and rejection of psychoanalysis, I think he has written two nice books. They are in Dutch, but these two books I think are worthwhile reading if you want to know why you shouldn't do psychoanalysis. What's wrong with it? So scientists might think they compare to paradigms and compare to each other and reality, but they are actually not commensurable, they're incommensurable according to Kuhn. So different paradigms generate different worldviews. They generate different worlds because we're talking about constructivism, right? So the theories or some of the theories in the paradigms are used to construct the facts. And then that means you don't have access to objective facts. You have only access to constructed facts. So different paradigms generate different worlds. And that means, in the end, that you cannot compare them rationally. Because what you would like to do is say, well, I have a paradigm here, and I have one here, and now I compare them to reality and see which one better fits the objective facts. But there are no objective facts. The facts are constructed by using some of the theories of the paradigm. And you can't talk to each other, just like the dictator and the democrat can't talk. The person in one paradigm, in the geocentric paradigm, cannot really talk with the person in the heliocentric paradigm, or the one still in the psychoanalytic paradigm cannot really talk with one that has rejected that and is, say, an identity theorist. In psychology, and says, well, you have to look at the brain if you want to understand the psyche, and well, stuff like that. So, for instance, in these two paradigms, Kuhn is referring to the geocentric and heliocentric paradigm. The reference of the words has changed. So, Earth used to mean center of the universe, and in the new paradigm, it doesn't mean that. So, if you're talking about the center of the universe, that's going to be confusing. You don't use your words in the same way. Atom, for us, in a different paradigm, if you look at a different paradigm, atom used to mean indivisible, and now we split atoms. So people in those two different paradigms can't really talk about atoms because they mean different things by the word, according to Kuhn. And that means you can't rationally compare the paradigms and compare them to reality, objective reality. There is no known objective reality. So that's the incommensurability thesis of Kuhn. That is, you might think you can compare them, but actually you cannot rationally compare paradigms. And that, I think, is in some sense counterintuitive, but understandable. So the logical positivists, they say, well, we can have disagreement, but we can talk about it, and we can see who's right, because they thought you could have access to the objective facts. And once you let go of that, or you think you have a convincing argument that that's impossible, then you construct the world, and then you might have different worldviews, but you can't really come to consensus when you debate it, because your words mean different things, you live in different worlds. And that means you have different mechanisms that make you go from one paradigm to another. It's not consensus, it's not rational comparison, even though you might think that. Because there, of course, is consensus among all the scientists accepting the new paradigm. So he calls this paradigm shift, or he compares it to a gestalt switch. So you have the gestalt, the entire picture, and it switches totally. Everything changes. So, for instance, this picture, you could see the bright white square as the top of a sugar cube. But you could also interpret this picture in a totally different way. That you can say, well, it looks like light falling through a roof. You look up, you see black ceiling, light coming from really clear sky outside and it looks like this. So this changes the entire picture. I'll get another example. Due to copyright reasons, I had to make one myself. I'm really not good at drawing stuff. So, but you probably know the picture of a duck rabbit, so a picture that can be interpreted as a duck and as a rabbit. So the left part of the picture can be seen as the ears of the rabbit or the beak of a duck. And you can change this. You can see it as a duck, you can see the picture as a rabbit, and then you can see it as a duck and again as a rabbit. So Kuhn says that's a little bit what a paradigm shift is. It's a total shift. And I put the quote here to show you that it's actually Kuhn who says this, and it's not my interpretation or something like that. He says, what were ducks in the scientific world before the revolution? What are ducks? What were ducks? What are ducks? So it's a claim about the fact. It's not about, oh, what we interpreted as ducks. No, it is what are ducks, what were ducks in the scientific world before the revolution, are rabbits afterwards. That's a radical claim. That's not saying, oh, we have a different worldview. No, we live in a different world. So that's what he claims. You can't go back though. So in this, you can see this picture. If you use the picture to look at it, and you say, well, I can see it as a rabbit, I can see it as a duck, I can see it as a rabbit, and I can see it as a duck. A paradigm shift, scientific revolution, is not something that you could go back and forth from to the different paradigms. Once you've changed paradigm, there's no way back. It's in other contexts, or in other parts of the book, he compares it to a religious conversion. So if you change religion, there's no way back. It's not that you say, well, today I'm an atheist, but maybe tomorrow I'm a Christian, and maybe the day after that I believe in multiple gods. Okay, there's no way back once you've changed paradigm. You can only change to a next paradigm once you have a crisis again and someone coming up with a new paradigm. So he makes this really strong claim. There's a change of world, and that the theory determines what you see. That's in some sense, I think, unproblematic. That is, if you look in your physiology books, then you'll see all kinds of brain structures, and you can also only see the brain structures if you have knowledge, if you have a theory about it, about the brain. Then you can see the cerebellum, then you can see the corpus callosum, then you can see V4 and all the lobe and stuff like that. You also see something, of course, if you have no knowledge, no theory about that. Of course, you see pictures and you probably recognize them as scans of brains or something like that, but you don't know what you're seeing. So in that case, I think it's very unproblematic that you see the cerebellum, you see the corpus callosum, once you know what you're looking at. And Kuhn sees, and you might be mistaken there, right? You do an exam, and there is this, I don't know whether you get exams like that, but you have, I can imagine for brain and behavior, you're getting a picture of a brain and you have to name the different areas. You have to name the cerebellum, and if you write corpus callosum there, it's wrong. So then you might have said, then you could say, well, I thought I interpreted the cerebellum as the corpus callosum or something. I saw, just like you could say, I saw something and I thought it was a rabbit, but it turned out to be a duck. But that would have, then you imply that you have access to the objective facts, and you see something as something else. And Kuhn seems to go much further. He says the theory, or he seems to be saying that the theory determines what there is. So the ontology is the word we use to describe the things that there are in the world, on being the old Greek for to be. So Kuhn says scientists do not see something as something else. They don't see a rabbit as a duck, mistakenly, or possibly mistakenly. No, instead they simply see it. And that is because you don't have access to the objective fact according to constructivists and relativists. The observation is radically theory laden, so you construct the facts. And that means you can't say, I'm seeing what is objectively a duck as a rabbit. No, you're seeing the rabbit. And that's the way you construct the world. There is no objective access to the objective fact. And that means that a new paradigm indeed is not better, because better means fitting the objective fact more reliably or more perfectly. Something like that. It's just different. Because if it was better, it would describe the world better. It would have more descriptions that correspond to the objective fact. And you can't say that because, well, either there are no objective facts, or at least we cannot know the objective facts. We don't have access to the objective facts, and that's necessary in order to make the claim that one paradigm is better than the other. Since we don't have that, we can't make the claim. Hence, you have to say, well, it's just different.
We have seen that Kuhn was not looking for a demarcation criterion, but we might argue that he actually did find one.
Kuhn stumbled upon a demarcation criterion. Even though he would deny that, it's clear he did. So he described changes in science. And he didn't look for a norm. Popper was looking for a norm and demarcation criterion. The logical positivists were looking for a norm and demarcation criterion. They failed. But it looks like that Kuhn has succeeded where he didn't intend to find a norm. And we'll evaluate Kuhn's theory in next lecture. But for the moment, you can say, okay, so what is the difference between having no science and having science? So you can, it already follows from the description he gives from the change between the pre-scientific period, where there was no science, to the period of normal science, where there is science. What's the big difference? What's the only difference? The only difference is that there is a paradigm. So that means that having a paradigm is the demarcation criterion. That makes the difference between science and no science, non-science. Okay, so if we accept that, and I'm not the only one thinking that, it's not that I say, well, there is this demarcation criterion, others have said it as well, we'll see that in a moment, that they try to apply it to, for instance, psychology, because Kuhn has made it fairly easy for himself by looking at physics and astronomy, because we're all in agreement that that's science. So if you want to describe the development of science, and you then describe the changes in physics and in astronomy, well, that's fairly obvious, but do the same for history and psychology and economics and sociology, human resource management. Can you give the same analysis there? It should be, because Kuhn is writing about science in general. And now the question, of course, is, okay, so do we find these paradigms in all these other different disciplines like sociology and economics and psychology? And of course, we're now going to address that last question. Is psychology a science according to the demarcation criterion found accidentally by Kuhn? So does psychology have a paradigm? And it's not totally clear because the opinions differ and there are arguments maybe in favor and against this view. So David Palermo, for instance, also accepts that Kuhn has stumbled upon a demarcation criterion and that the demarcation criterion is having a paradigm. He says, yes, psychology is a science because it already had a first paradigm with introspectionism. So introspectionism was the first paradigm of psychology. So once that was accepted, psychology was a science, the science of the mind. And there's even been a crisis. One problem, of course, is that we believe that animals do have minds as well, and you can't have animals report on their internal subjective mental lives. So you can't do any research. And then the revolution came with behaviorism. And then you can observe the behavior and say, well, we have seen that in the philosophy of mind course, and you've seen that in your philosophy of psychology course. Then you can do research also with respect to animals. So Palermo says behaviorism became the new paradigm. So that would be the second paradigm. So the demarcation criterion is having a paradigm, and of course a paradigm can get into a crisis, and then you can have a scientific revolution. We already had this scientific revolution. That's not the demarcation criterion, but we already had one, says Palermo. And of course, these days, we are not behaviorists anymore. That's one problem. Another problem is that Warren, for instance, says, well, Palermo he basically says Palermo has confirmation bias. And he forgets that behaviorism was only popular in the USA and not in Europe. So there was no consensus. And the idea, of course, is that there are no paradigms existing at the same time. And if there are like paradigm-like structures and things existing at the same time, that would still be the pre-scientific period. So it's pre-paradigmatic science. And then the question, of course, is, well, does psychology has psychology one accepted paradigm at this moment? And maybe the paradigm is evolutionary psychology or materialism, and they are closely related. Maybe that's the paradigm from which you all work, that if you want to understand the human psyche, you have to be a materialist and think in an evolutionary way about the mind. That's something I just pose here as a question to you. And, well, of course, I could ask on an exam. And then you have to come up with an answer to that. So you really have to apply it. Okay, so it's not very clear, but I think it's clear that Kuhn has stumbled upon a demarcation criterion, even though he didn't want to.
So even though he didn't try to find a demarcation criterion, one might argue that he did find one.
Kuhn set out just to describe science and scientific changes. By accident, he found a demarcation criterion, even though he said he didn't. And that's something we'll have to take a look into next time.
Next time, we look at a constructivist and relativist that is maybe more consequent even than Thomas Kuhn is, and then we'll evaluate constructivism and relativism. Basically, we answer the question, why isn't everyone a relativist and a constructivist?
Prior to evaluating constructivism and relativism, and also evaluating Kuhn's views, we'll discuss Feyerabend, and after the evaluation, we'll take a look at someone who actually is not a relativist and a constructivist, but was a good friend of Paul Feyerabend, and that's Imre Lakatos. And then we'll see that, we'll see that Feyerabend basically returns to epistemology, so he goes away from philosophy of science to epistemology, and Lakatos turns back to philosophy of science and turns back to the problem of the demarcation criterion. And I hope you will agree with me that at least if we look at Lakatos, we have a way of properly distinguishing science from pseudoscience. And of course, the question then is psychology a science according to what Lakatos tells us? What type of question can you expect about this lecture on Wittgenstein and Kuhn? Is, according to Thomas Kuhn, growth of knowledge possible? The answer is yes, so C and D are incorrect. It's only A or B. And when is growth of knowledge possible? When you solve a little problem, a little puzzle in a paradigm. So in a paradigm, there are always loose ends. If you solve a problem within a paradigm, if you solve a puzzle within a paradigm, then you know a little bit more within that paradigm. So there's growth of knowledge possible. But when there is a paradigm shift, when there is a scientific revolution, we are inclined to think that that is growth of knowledge, that we know more. But Kuhn says, no, we don't know more. We just start from scratch. It's a new paradigm. It doesn't build on the previous paradigm. So it's not growth of knowledge. So the answer is B. Yes, growth of knowledge is possible according to Thomas Kuhn. That's exactly what happens when a problem is solved within a paradigm.
That's it for lecture 6. Stay safe.